Imagine a marriage that seemed to be the definition of luxury, power, and wealth. On one side, a millionaire heir from one of Miami's most iconic families. On the other, a woman consumed by jealousy, control, and ambition. What should have been a life of glamour turned into a spiral of hatred, violence, and ultimately, one of the most shocking crimes in American high society. Today, we dive into the case of Ben Novack Jr., a man who inherited not only the name of an empire, but also the enemies he made along the way, and Narcy Novack, the woman the media would call the millionaire black widow, accused of turning love into hatred and ambition into blood. Get ready to uncover the dark secrets behind a toxic relationship that began with luxury and ended in tragedy. We'll reveal how passion became possession, how trust turned into manipulation, and how a wedding ring transformed into a death sentence. Before we begin this investigation, make sure to subscribe to Dr. Investigation, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Here, you'll always find the most impactful true crime stories, told with details few have ever seen. And now, let's get into the case. Ben Novack Jr. was no ordinary man. He was born into an empire, surrounded by luxury and status from the very beginning. The son of Ben Novack Sr., founder of the legendary Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, one of the most iconic symbols of Florida's golden era, Ben grew up in an environment where wealth and power were as natural as the air he breathed. But inheriting a powerful name also meant carrying a heavy burden. From an early age, Ben Jr. lived under the shadow of a dominating father, a man who built an empire but also collected enemies and scandals. And when that empire eventually crumbled, it was a son who inherited not just a fortune, but also the pressure and scars of a family accustomed to excess and conflict. As an adult, Ben reinvented himself as a convention organizer, hosting major corporate gatherings and themed events. He was a businessman always on the move, but also an eccentric figure. He obsessively collected rare Batman memorabilia, spending millions on items that seemed to fill a void luxury alone could never satisfy. Yet, alongside his wealth and quirks, there was a darker side. Many describe Ben as arrogant, controlling, and even cruel in his personal relationships. This blend of power, emotional fragility, and eccentricity would ultimately make him a vulnerable target. And ironically, the danger would come from within his own home. To the public, he was the heir to a respected name. Behind the scenes, he was a man torn between the weight of his family's legacy and the inner demons he could never escape. And it was within this world of contradictions that the woman who would forever change his destiny entered his life, Narcy Novack. If Ben Novack Jr. represented the legacy of a family marked by wealth and power, Narcy Novack was the opposite, a woman from humble beginnings who had always sought to climb the social ladder. A former exotic dancer, Narcy carried with her a charisma that drew attention, but also an intensity that would, sooner or later, turn into obsession. She met Ben at a time when he was already a wealthy man, surrounded by luxury and eccentricities. To many, it seemed unlikely that a millionaire heir would fall for someone like Narcy, but her magnetism proved irresistible. What began as an improbable romance quickly turned into marriage, and with it, Narcy gained access to a life she had once only dreamed of. But make no mistake, she was not just a companion in Ben's world. Inside the relationship, Narcy exercised absolute control. She decided where they went, who they associated with, and even influenced the directions of Ben's business ventures. Close friends would later recall that while Ben projected strength and arrogance in public, he seemed to shrink in front of his wife. It was as if her power came not only from love, but from fear. Narcy was described as extremely jealous. She tolerated no rivals, real or imagined, and reacted aggressively to any perceived threat to her dominance. At the same time, she knew how to manipulate, using charm when it suited her, and turning ruthless when she needed to impose her will. This mixture of seduction and tyranny made her an enigmatic and dangerous figure. For Ben, marriage to Narcy was both a prison and a necessity. He surrendered to the relationship, yet seemed incapable of breaking free. As if, in some twisted way, the luxury and intensity of their bond kept him trapped in a web of emotional and psychological dependence. This explosive combination of jealousy, ambition, and power set the stage for one of the darkest stories in American true crime. Because when love intertwines with control and greed, The ending is almost always tragic. July 2009. The hotel in Rybrook, New York, was hosting yet another convention organized by Ben Novack Jr., just like so many others that had become part of his routine. To outsiders, it looked like just another business event, where the millionaire heir maintained his influence in the industry. But that night, behind silent hallways and closed doors, a deadly plan was reaching its final act. Ben's body was discovered in room 306. He had been bound, immobilized, and brutally beaten. The scene left no doubt. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was a calculated execution, carried out with cruelty. The injuries showed that Ben had been attacked over a prolonged period, as if each strike had been deliberate, not simply to kill him, but to make him suffer. The brutality was overwhelming. His face was disfigured, his eyes targeted, his wrists tied with vicious force. Everything pointed to a clear message. This was not just a murder. It was a crime driven by hatred, vengeance, or ambition pushed to its limits. And perhaps the most disturbing detail, nothing had been stolen. Jewelry, cash, valuables, everything remained untouched. Whoever came into that room wanted nothing but Ben's life. Almost immediately, the question echoed among investigators. Who hated Ben Novack Jr. enough to orchestrate such a cruel death? The first suspicion inevitably fell on Narcy Novack. She was at the hotel, on the very same floor, yet claimed she had neither seen nor heard anything. An account that sounded highly improbable, given the level of violence that had taken place just steps away. For detectives, the doubt was unavoidable. Was Narcy merely a wife in shock, or the mastermind who had orchestrated every detail that night? As investigators examined the room, one detail became clear. This was not the work of random criminals. There was no rush, no signs of a chaotic struggle. There was calm, planning, and precision. The room had been transformed into a trap, carefully staged to ensure Ben had no chance of survival. The irony was brutal. A man who had grown up surrounded by wealth and power, heir to one of the most prominent names in American hospitality, now lay defenseless, reduced to a victim of sheer violence. And as Ben's body was taken away for examination, suspicion began to gather around Narcy. Her cold demeanor, controlled posture, and lack of tears caught the investigators' attention. Right there, the suspicion was born that this was not just murder, but a conspiracy conceived within the very walls of the marriage itself. As police tried to understand who might have wanted Ben Novack Jr. dead, investigators began to look back in time. The murder in Rybrook didn't seem like an isolated crime. On the contrary, there were echoes of a past already stained by violence. 3 years earlier, in 2006, Ben's mother, Bernice Novack, had been found dead in her own home in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. At first glance, the scene appeared to be a tragic household accident, a fatal fall in the bathroom, but the details never quite added up. Signs of impact, inconsistencies in the initial report, and the speed with which the case was closed raised silent doubts. What seemed like an accident began to take on a new meaning in light of Ben's brutal murder. It was as if history was repeating itself, only now on an even darker scale. And who had been present in both events? Narcy Novack. As investigators pressed forward, a pattern began to emerge. The marriage between Ben and Narcy wasn't just troubled, it was a constant battlefield. Narcy controlled every aspect of her husband's life, and her jealousy knew no limits. Friends recounted how any woman near Ben was treated as a rival, and Narcy made sure to humiliate or drive away anyone she saw as a threat, whether real or imagined. Her psychological profile was becoming clearer to investigators, a woman defined by possession, by fear of losing what she had gained, and by the willingness to use violence as a tool of control. And then came a critical realization. While Bernice's death had left no solid proof, Ben's murder showed clear signs of premeditation. Evidence suggested that others might have been involved, that this wasn't the work of a lone attacker. The crime bore the mark of conspiracy. Investigators understood they were dealing with something far bigger than a crime of passion. It was a scheme that involved family, money, and power. And with each new discovery, the circle tightened around Narcy and those who had helped her turn hatred into execution. The Novack family's dark past didn't just explain the present. It revealed that tragedy had always been inevitable. Ben carried a surname haunted by scandals, and Narcy carried a cold determination never to be left out of the fortune that was at stake. When the investigation seemed to be going in circles, with no definitive proof against Narcy, a new element emerged that would completely change the course of the case. Days after Ben's murder, investigators received an anonymous letter written in Spanish. Its content was explosive. It detailed the direct involvement of Narcy Novack and her brother, Cristóbal Véliz, in planning the crime. The letter described how Narcy had arranged for men to kill her husband and ensure she would not lose access to his fortune. This wasn't just a vague accusation. The document contained details only someone close to the plot could have known. For investigators, this was a turning point. With this lead in hand, police began to follow the family's financial and phone records. They uncovered that Cristóbal had recruited accomplices to carry out the attack, orchestrating each move with precision. The murder was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was a carefully crafted plan, involving payments, secret meetings, and explicit orders about how Ben was to be killed. Evidence showed that Narcy didn't just know about the plot. She had directed every detail. Witnesses testified that she had managed the logistics, chosen the right moment to strike, and even ensured her presence at the hotel to deflect suspicion in the immediate aftermath. What once seemed like coincidence now appeared to be strategy. The investigation also revealed a clear motive: money. Ben's fortune was protected by specific clauses, and Narcy feared losing everything if the marriage ended. Ben's death meant not only revenge for years of jealousy and conflict, but also the key to securing control over millions of dollars. This breakthrough transformed the entire case. What had seemed like another tragic marital dispute was now exposed as a family conspiracy, executed with chilling precision. From that point on, there was no doubt in the eyes of investigators. Narcy Novack was not a grieving widow. She was a millionaire black widow who had turned hatred, jealousy, and ambition into a death sentence. The trial of Narcy Novack and her brother Cristóbal Véliz was not just a legal proceeding. It became a spectacle, followed by the press like a macabre soap opera, where luxury, ambition, and blood collided in every testimony. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, onlookers, and even old acquaintances of the family gathered to witness every detail. Narcy, seated before the jury, maintained a cold, almost defiant posture. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. To some, she looked like the very image of guilt. To others, a woman refusing to bend under pressure. The prosecution built a solid case. They presented phone records connecting Narcy and Cristóbal to the hired killers. They revealed financial transfers, evidence of payments, and testimonies describing how the conspiracy had been orchestrated step by step. The portrait painted by the prosecutors was clear. Narcy had turned her marriage into a death trap, with her brother acting as a right hand in its execution. Prosecutors went further, linking the death of Bernice Novack, Ben's mother, to the same pattern of conspiracy. They argued that the 2006 killing had been a rehearsal, and by escaping justice once, Narcy felt emboldened to take the next step against her own husband. This connection to the past gave the case even more weight, showing that this was not an isolated act, but a trajectory of calculated violence. The defense tried to fight back. They claimed there was no direct proof against Narcy, suggested that the attackers may have acted on their own, and attempted to portray her as the victim of an abusive relationship with Ben. But in the face of mounting evidence, and Narcy's icy demeanor in court, those arguments sounded weak. The witnesses were damning. Former friends and acquaintances recounted outbursts of rage, veiled threats, and jealous tirades that revealed Narcy's explosive temperament. Each testimony reinforced the image of a woman who could not tolerate losing control, and who would go to any lengths to preserve her power and fortune. When the verdict was finally read, the entire courtroom held its breath. The jury found Narcy Novack and Cristóbal Véliz guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The sentence was harsh and final: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reaction spoke volumes. Cristóbal lowered his head in silence. Narcy, however, stared straight ahead, showing no remorse. No tears, no pleas. Just a cold gaze that confirmed the image built throughout the trial. That of a woman who had gone from jealous wife to the architect of a brutal execution. The trial sealed not only Narcy's fate, but also the downfall of the Novack family legacy. A name once associated with luxury and glamour was now forever tied to violence and unbridled ambition. With the verdict delivered, the fate of Narcy Novack and Cristóbal Véliz was sealed once and for all. Both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no appeal capable of restoring the life of luxury and influence they once enjoyed. It was the end of a conspiracy that had destroyed not only a man, but the reputation of an entire family. The image of Narcy leaving the courtroom became forever etched in the memory of those who followed the case. While Cristóbal kept his head down, resigned to his fate, Narcy walked with the same cold, expressionless gaze she had maintained throughout the trial. No remorse, no grief. It was as if, to the very last moment, she refused to embrace the role of the guilty party. For many, that icy silence spoke louder than words. With the conviction, the Novack family's legacy crumbled. A surname once associated with the glamour of the Fontainebleau Hotel, a symbol of Miami's golden age, where celebrities flocked and films were shot, was now forever tainted by murder and greed. What remained of Ben's fortune became tied up in legal disputes, and instead of preserving the family name, his inheritance turned into a symbol of its downfall. Public opinion was unforgiving. Newspapers and television shows branded Narcy as the millionaire Black Widow, cementing the image of a woman capable of turning love into a weapon and marriage into a death sentence. Her cold composure after the crime became a subject of morbid fascination for criminologists and the general public alike. In the end, the Novack tragedy left a stark message. When power, jealousy, and money collide in explosive measure, the outcome is rarely anything but destruction. Ben, heir to an empire, lost his life in a brutal manner. Narcy, who believed she could have it all, ended up in prison forever, and the Novack name, once synonymous with glamour, was left permanently scarred by the shadow of violence. The story of Ben and Narcy Novack is both fascinating and disturbing. A marriage born in luxury, but ending in blood. An heir who had everything to carry on his family's name, and a wife who turned love into obsession, and finally, into a weapon. What stands out in this case is not only the brutal murder, but the chain of choices that led to it. Jealousy, greed, and the hunger for control blended into a lethal mix until tragedy became inevitable. Ben believed he was in charge of his own life, but the real trap was inside his own home. The downfall of the Novack family carries a clear lesson. No matter how vast the empire, no fortune can withstand the destruction born from toxic relationships. The money that once symbolized status and power became the very fuel for violence. But now, the questions are for you. Backhand index pointing right, do you believe Narcy acted solely for money? Or was this also personal revenge, fueled by years of jealousy and resentment? Backhand index pointing right, how far can a relationship go before it turns into a prison? And, in the Novack's case, into a death sentence? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you interpret this story. And if this video kept you watching until the end, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with someone who enjoys true crime stories, and most importantly, subscribe to Dr. Investigation. Here, you'll always find stories that reveal the darkest side of human nature. Because in the end, the Novack case reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the most passionate love is also the most destructive. The Novack case showed us how love, jealousy, and ambition can turn into a lethal mix. An empire built over decades ended in blood. And a surname that once stood for glamour and power is now remembered for the coldness of a woman and the brutality of a crime. Stories like this force us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The greatest dangers don't always come from the outside. Many times, they're inside the very home where love and trust are supposed to live. And that's why Dr. Investigation is here, to uncover the real stories that reveal the darkest side of the human mind. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes, and leave a like. It helps us continue investigating cases the world should never forget. Thank you for watching until the end. And remember, behind every great crime, there's always a hidden truth waiting to be revealed.